discussing Russian sanctions earlier this morning and the hardships they can pose on citizens and also on governments. They also pose questions and challenges for business, and that is going to be the subject of our next panel. Let me introduce Rachel Samrén. She is Senior Vice President and Chief of External Affairs, Governance and Trust Officer at Telia. She will handle this next conversation. Rachel.
Thank you, Jean, for that warm welcome. And I would like to extend the welcome to our panelists here this afternoon, who between them possess tremendous experience in working with and across countries and governments in both democratic and non-democratic corners of the world. With us, we have Wolfgang Niedermark, a member of the Executive Board of the Federation of German Industries, and with a past working also with and for German business across Asia in particular, and also China, from what I understand. As well as Ben Crawford, CEO of the London Stock Exchange listed CentralNic, one of the world's leading providers of internet infrastructure services and a true believer in the power of technology. Welcome to you both. Today's or this afternoon's panel or session is provocatively called Trading with the Enemy, Russia, Sanctions and Business Responsibility. Starting with you, perhaps, Wolfgang, Germany's voice naturally weighs heavily in any EU discussion on sanctions in relation to the situation in Ukraine. And I would assume that the voice of German industry weighs heavily within that. From your perspective, have German businesses done enough following Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And not just looking at the past, perhaps also looking forward. We have the sixth sanctions package just adopted by the EU. It does involve oil, but the big elephant in the room perhaps is gas. From your perspective, what are your thoughts on cutting more ties? Would Germany or German industry be willing to go further?
Yeah, we are doing the utmost what we can in order to achieve our goal, which we strive for with the sanctions. Of course, we are compliant. I would say we are even over-compliant. From the very first day, we said, actually, we don't need the policymakers to tell us what to do. We want to turn off Russia business under these circumstances. So, of course, there is an over-compliance due to all kinds of logistic and financial burdens, but there is an over-compliance for all those companies who simply want to step out of business. And I can assure you, German business has written off Russia for the time being. And that means for a couple of years, until a certain stage of catharsis where we see real change in Russia coming up, but that may be in 10, I don't know how long time. How many years, and that's the situation. You cannot switch it off like the light from one day to the other, but we have a certain responsibility for our own employees. We have a responsibility for the normal people in Russia who need health care provided by Western and German companies as well. So we don't want to take revenge from normal Russian people. But we are phasing out the Russia business for long and for good. Mm-hmm. With gas, perhaps I should answer that question as well, is a different story. We have taken all measures to step out of coal immediately. We are supportive for all these oil sanctions. We were disappointed that it was not possible to impose these sanctions to a degree we have planned for. Due to the Hungarian resistance. But with gas is really a different story. It's not possible right now to step out of gas. It's true for the whole of Europe, I would say. We don't want to kill our industry and overdo in a way. There should be not more harm to ourselves than we can create to Russia. But we do, again, the utmost to step out of gas as well, perhaps next year.
Mm-hmm. Ben, businesses have acted in an unprecedented fashion, at least on the level that we've seen over the last couple of months, individually, through trade associations and with trade associations, as well as, of course, because of sanctions and regulatory-induced measures. Going back to that day in February when you woke up, what was going through your mind from a business perspective, and what were your considerations for the future at that point? What did you look at, what you needed to do or not? And if you look at it in a bigger perspective also, is it really the role of business to be the one to act first? Your thoughts on that?
Just to give some background, we at CentralNic we serve what we call the three E's, which is entrepreneurs, enterprises, and e-government, who all together work to create an internet which is global, which is free, which is accessible, and that means we serve customers in almost every country in the world with different types of governments, democratic, but also monarchies, single-party systems, and so on, all in the service, though, of the internet itself. And obviously that means we do have a constant eye to sanctions and make sure that we're always compliant. Say in this case, we couldn't wait for the sanctions. We have many of our staff are in countries adjacent to the Ukraine, in Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and so on. And so the refugees are an immediate thing that we had to be concerned with, as well as staff with family directly affected. And so I guess our first thoughts are always for our own people and how they're affected. But then an important consideration for us is that many international organizations, from parts of the United Nations through to luxury brands and consumer product companies, entrust us with their domain name portfolios, which are like the trademarks of the internet. And so many of these had .ru and Belarusian and so on domain names, and we had to make a decision. If we didn't renew these, if we didn't keep them alive, that would mean they would be lost, this intellectual property, and fall into the hands of cyber criminals, counterfeiters, or worse. So clearly we, at the end, realized our first responsibility was to maintain that intellectual property. And if that meant that we had to continue to do business with Russia in a small way, that was necessary for something more important. However, we wanted to make it clear that we weren't doing this for our own benefit, so any of that money that we've made was donated immediately to the Red Cross in the Ukraine. And anything beyond just protecting the existing intellectual property of these international companies and organizations, we decided not to do. So in addition to that, we've rendered all of our services for free to people in the Ukraine. All of that really added up to some millions of dollars of foregone revenue and so on, but I can state with certainty that our board, our staff, our investors and so on, nobody queried for 1 minute that was the right action for us to take. To be clear, there are no sanctions specifically against the services that we render, and in fact there's specific exceptions for them, because obviously it's been the work of decades to build a global internet which does provide alternative sources of information to people all over the world, and it would be a terrible thing to risk that. It would probably have have effects exactly counter to what I think democracies would like to see.
That said, though, we're hearing the view that German business is done with Russia for quite some time to come. Are we then perhaps looking at a scenario where we will be seeing a bifurcated business world between democracies and autocracies? How will the future of business then look a couple of years ahead?
Yeah. We learned it the hard way how serious the situation can be, but my organization have published a paper last year dealing with the question, how can we still cooperate with autocracies in a responsible way of coexistence? And of course, we put a strong responsibility on the shoulders of the companies. The companies cannot shy away from their own political responsibility and their ambition to defend democracy. That's a fundamental environment they are prosperous in, and in their own interests they are political actors and they have a responsibility. So that's the basic thing. Now we have seen Russia crossing all the red lines, not accepting that is not to be accepted by anyone, and we do the biggest steps to prevent Putin to be successful and to help Ukraine. And these red lines are not set alone by politics, but they are also set for companies by companies, and they have to act along these red lines.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're touching on there, seeing companies as political actors is, of course, slightly controversial. There are those that would argue that companies should not be the one to interfere where governments have a role to play. But perhaps also over the last months, we have seen indeed increasingly that businesses have stepped in and acted. We heard also this morning from Google saying that they have.
Don't get me wrong, it's not the only, it's not only business who is a political actor. It's of course the duty of our governments to interfere. But companies cannot shy away from their part of responsibility.
And is that perhaps a risk for democracy in itself? Ben, your thoughts on when we're looking now at businesses really stepping in and acting faster? Sometimes, as you said, you weren't waiting for the sanctions regimes. You took some decisions. Is it problematic that companies become the decision makers of when and how to defend democracy?
Well, I think that, as we've heard, companies certainly have a responsibility to, but that doesn't mean that there's a necessity for governments to step back. In fact, particularly in the area of technology, there's and the internet, there's a long history of a multi-stakeholder approach to developing policy, because clearly it's very much frequently up to business to handle the execution of many policies. And that's certainly something that we would be advocating is a close partnership. I think getting back to your earlier question, though, about a bifurcation, I mean, at the end of the day, there is only one world. There aren't two. And particularly with the internet connecting people from all over the world, we in fact think that it's ethically the right thing to do when a non-democratic state comes to us and asks us for assistance with liberalizing the internet in their country, which is typically our role. If you look at less developed countries, they often have a very small internet presence with government departments and a few businesses owned by the prominent families in that country. But now many of them are seeking to liberalize that, to encourage entrepreneurs within their country to build a digital economy, to encourage overseas companies to register and maintain their intellectual property in those countries. And we feel that all of those are a good way for those countries to move. So our responsibility is not solely to punish, but also to empower and to encourage the right direction for countries all over the world.
We heard this morning about the need for resolve, looking forward a little bit, you know, sort of the CNN effect perhaps fading away when we start tiring of seeing news about Ukraine. With that in mind, will German business keep its resolve? It sounds like from what you're saying that you're seeing this in a very medium to long-term perspective. Will all the businesses really feel the same way, even the small and medium-sized enterprises, when the numbers are starting to really be affected?
Yeah, of course, I see a certain danger that there will be this fatigue. But all in all, I see that we have this decisive moment where we are all waking up, that this good old type of globalization is over, that we run into a more bipolar world, perhaps multipolar. We will strive for solutions that we can still do business with countries who have a completely different political and societal setup. And then country by country, you have to decide where your own red lines are. In Myanmar, it's very easy to understand for everyone that you step out in a country where the army shoots its own people. In China, it's of course by far more complicated. Of course, we want to stay in business with China. We want to cooperate with China. Look at the climate protection issue, look at perhaps the next pandemic, logistics, all kinds of questions where we need to cooperate. As you just said, we have just one world. But there are, even in China, and perhaps there might be even worse situations, but Xinjiang is bad enough. There are already cases where you have internally in China red lines to be acknowledged. And this is a very complicated setup, and this is not an easy answer for each and every country and company in a very general way, but case by case you have to decide what can I do without offending my own values and sticking to my own code of conduct.
And if I may, on that topic of defending your own values, one of the questions that have come in from the audience, and a reminder, please feel free to submit your questions through the app, is that, of course, relating to Germany allowing its companies to pay for Russian gas in rubles and seeing that as a direct financing of the war. Where is the balance in terms of those values, protecting the German economy versus losing Ukrainian lives every day?
Yeah, I know. This is the everyday question and is really a painful question. And our preference would be that we are in a position to stop it tomorrow. But we cannot. As I said before, it's not only a German problem. We have these debates in our Business Europe environment. It's a European issue that we need a certain supply for a certain time of fossil energy from Russia. It was a mistake to bring us in this situation. We are seeing it clear now. We were, I would not say blind, but over optimistic that nothing will happen. It happened. Now we see that it was a mistake, but we cannot simply stop from one day to the other. Then, as I said before, it is more harm to ourselves than to Russia. By the way, there are a lot of technical issues. I don't see that it is feasible to simply stop it. It's a very complex process. By the way, that would have effect and very far-reaching negative effects to the rest of the world, then this part of the global gas market is missing, and this amount of gas is lacking, and it is desperately needed, at least also for producing fertilizers and all kind of nutrition stuff. And if we stop the supply, then we, as the rich countries, we will find compensation. And the next layer is in the developing world, where countries may not afford to buy LNG to the new price level. And that will create a lot of problems. And look at the wheat market these days. It's really problematic. And that is a very complex thing, and it would not help to stop gas supply from Russia to Europe from one day to the other.
And taking that perhaps a step further and at the same time breaking it into some very simple components, I think what I hear you saying really is that at times you do need to trade with the enemy. You need to continue to trade with the enemy in order to ensure that we can actually keep the fabric of the societies, the democratic societies that we so treasure. Am I hearing that correctly? That, you know, the trading with the enemy is not a zero-sum question. There are so many complexities, and as Ben was pointing out, it is such an interconnected world that it is a very, very complicated decision-making.
Yeah, and if we do more harm to our economies, we have a problem internally. Also, democracies have to deliver wealth and prosperity and jobs. And if we cannot deliver, we have our folks on the street protesting. And we have seen a lot of dangerous developments also in our own democratic countries. If the economic pressure and the inequalities and some disadvantages of globalization are hitting our own people, then we run into problem with the stability of our own democracies.
Of course, as time goes on, as we've seen previously, there will be more and more ways of avoiding sanctions, perhaps, or working around them, if you like. Your views, Ben, on is there a way to impose secondary sanctions? What can we do to ensure that this avoidance doesn't start taking place the longer this goes on?
Well, I think I could answer that together with perhaps your earlier question about fatigue around sanctions, around the urgency to act in situations like the one we're currently in. I think today we're listed on the London Stock Exchange, and pretty much every company that's listed on a major stock exchange is reporting regularly and significantly around their environmental policies and activities, around their governance, and around their social responsibilities and activities. And it would seem like there would certainly be a role within those guidelines, which are often pointing to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to also look towards, for instance, quite detailed explanations of exactly how sanctions are being followed, assurances that they're not being circumvented, inclusion of that in the kind of ESG auditing and reporting type of processes and so on. It would seem to be a natural place for those elements to be focused on, be monitored, be audited, be reported, and be discussed.
And do you see an expansion of ESG reporting, perhaps also to include something on democratic values more specifically than what we currently have today, something that is measurable in terms of company behavior, not in human rights broadly as we have it today, but very specific on democratic issues? That is not currently reported on as part of an ESG metrics, but is that something
potentially? I think it would need a lot of definition, because clearly on the one hand, I would say our companies encouraging democratic behavior, meaning that opening up the world of communication and information and participation to a larger and larger number of people under all kinds of different political regimes. That for us is democratization, whilst the regimes in some of those countries may not actually operate in a way that's recognized as democratic. So there's many subtleties, but I would certainly see that as an area that could be explored further.
Wolfgang?
Definitely not our concept to have these kind of requirements in ESG reporting on top of what we already have. And I don't think we need it. Our concept is more striving for coexistence in a responsible manner and then lead by example. And this will be a track where we see a lot of progress coming up now by main drivers, which is, of course, policymakers and media, reputational issues. But you have as well the critical consumer, your client, who is no longer willing to buy products from countries where which are produced in a critical environment. You have the financial markets and all these ESG reporting. And then the most important factor is in our companies in itself. It's our employees and the next generation of leaders, which is younger people. It's more female. Listen, you have listened yesterday to what Mrs. Albright said. Young people and more women will change it. It will be more oriented to sustainable goals. And these drivers, to my perception, are strong enough to bring us there. And then we don't need formal requirements in ESG reporting.
Very good to hear such positive outlook on a Friday afternoon. Now, of course, an elephant in the room when we're discussing sanctions and the business world's reaction, China and Taiwan. And we have some questions that have come in from the audience on that, but maybe we start very broadly. If we think ahead of such a dreadful scenario, would there be the same willingness from the business world to cut ties as we have seen over the last months? If you want to go ahead, Ben, from your perspective.
I think the answer is yes. However, preventing that scenario needs to be the absolute main focus for business and government, and that involves open discussion, participation, support, engagement, not waiting for some terrible calamity to occur and then making policy decisions.
Yeah, similar answer from my side. It would be such an issue, and it was the dimension of a problem with China would be manifold compared to Russia. And you see how big the Russian problem is, and the burdens we have to cope with. It's not, by the way, not to do business with Russia any longer. It's also our duty to help Ukraine to rebuild. That will go into the billions again. Yeah, that's also our responsibility, and we cannot protect our consumers, our people, from rising prices with all these effects. But if I would imagine that we run into a similar trap with China, then you cannot protect anyone any longer. It will be, the result will be really economic turmoil, because the dependency on Chinese raw materials, processed raw materials, rare earths, precious metals, and intermediate products, and of course consumer products is huge. And that would create an immense problem, and I can only hope that this will not occur, but we have to prepare. We have to be aware that it could happen. And the paramount leader has told us that his ambition is to reunite the motherland with Taiwan. So we have to prepare for the situation. I don't expect, by the way, China to do it in a similar way, in a simple military aggression. That's not our expectation, but we were wrong with Russia. So how can we be sure that it will not happen in China? I don't know. We have to be prepared, and we have to diversify, and we have to get out of this dependency from China alone. And that's true for Europe, for German companies, for some of them more than others. Same for America, perhaps less than Europe. But we all together, Australia, Japan, everyone has to diversify and to unite within our own sphere. So more cooperation among democracies, among like-minded, a better internal market that would create a lot of market opportunities, and that makes it easier to diversify less China, not stepping out of China. China is important. It is also very important for the main challenges of mankind, climate protection and so forth. So it's not an option to decouple, it's not an option to get out, but diversification is key. Africa is also a key word here.
And on that latter point, maybe to finish off with, it's very clear what you see, the role of industry and businesses in preparation. Ben, you've mentioned this self. What about the European governments? What is their role? What should they do to make sure that that decoupling and yet the preservation of values on the one hand and the relevant business environment on the other hand? What is the role of the European governments in looking ahead those black swan scenarios and the China situation?
Well, I think if we saw last week that the G7 information ministers put out a paper inviting and asking business to help support them in terms of the kind of first initial stages of that type of hostility, which is around the internet, which is around hacking and cyber attacks and so on. So I think those first steps are already clearly being taken, that many of the European and larger governments are engaging with industry today in preparation both for negative scenarios, but also to try and ensure that those negative scenarios don't occur. And obviously we would add to that, trying to encourage positive outcomes.
Yeah. I think the European governments are on the right track. We work on our fitness. We have this concept of European resilience, open strategic autonomy, not autarky, very important difference. And we are working on reciprocity. We are working on our defense instruments, anti-coercion. We have seen the Lithuania case. We were really strong in solidarity with Lithuania. It's not acceptable what China is doing in this case. We have investment screening. We have this anti-subsidy law. We cannot allow Chinese companies to have better conditions than we have for European companies in our own market. So we have to work on our setup here in Europe. And what I see, the Commission is willing to do so, and the national governments as well. So we are on the right track.
So in summary, a lot of preparation, realism, cooperation, a role for both business, for the private sector, for governments, for organizations like this to jointly prepare. But let us hope that we won't be needing the outcomes of those preparations. And as you said, Wolfgang, with a generation taken over where actually the values do come before much else, and where the leadership hopefully will be different and help us avoid those scenarios. With that, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you, Rachel.